Hey everyone! So the ethical codes I will be explaining in this presentation are 3.4 and 3.5. Both focus on assessing behavior. For explanation of the code, the first thing I want to do is give some background information. So the behavior analyst requires a baseline in order to begin treatment, and an observation of the behavior in the environment that the behavior occurs is needed, and the observation needs to be done by a trained professional, and that professional needs to record the occurrences of the behavior as well as the circumstance in order to develop data that does determine treatment. And the behavior needs to be observable and operationally defined. So this code explains what goes into an ethical behavior assessment. I'll explain more on this later in the presentation, but this code is in place because otherwise you would have to rely on biased info. There would be no data to support treatment because it would be from untrained guesses. So 3.4, explaining assessment results. Our textbook, Bailey and Birch, explains that the behavior analyst must explain assessment results using language and graphic displays of data that are reasonably understandable to the client. So basically, if you are involved in special education currently, like I myself am a special educator, this is something that you do every time you have a triennial meeting. You give a specialized assessment for your student, you type up an evaluation report, and often I include a table in the report and graphed data to kind of show the results and show the growth of my student, and then I explain those results in a way that my parent can understand. That's exactly what behavior analysts do. They explain what the baseline is to the parent and have graphs, have tables, anything visual to help support that baseline data, and then they discuss next steps. So an example I came up with is that there's a behavior analyst and they're asked to come and observe a 9-year-old girl who is engaging in off-task behavior. The behavior is so extreme of her just not doing any work that the child's teacher has contacted the parents and said she wants to retain her because she doesn't think she can be successful in the next grade. Parents are really uncomfortable with this, so they asked for this outside evaluation and this outside observation. So let's say the girl's off-task behavior is laying her head on the table during independent work. So the behavior analyst would go in and get that baseline data. So let's say she observed her for 2 days and observed the number of times she laid her head down and how long it was and what was happening before and what happened after. And they compiled all that data in a graph, and then they met with the parents to discuss the occurrences of the behavior and the potential function of the behavior, and they explain it to them in a way that they can understand and in a way that they can develop a plan to move forward, and they can have that data to take to the school to argue the case for no retention. You need to have this in place in order for our daughter to be successful. The next code is 3.5, consent client records. So our textbook again says that the behavior analyst must obtain the written consent of the client before obtaining or disclosing client records from or to other sources for assessment purposes. So again, if you're a special educator like myself, this is something you are used to in terms of the IEP team. So you cannot disclose any information on your students on IEPs with anyone outside of that IEP team unless the parent signs that release of confidentiality information form, and then you can only share it with the person or institution that is written on that form. And so same with behavior analysis, you have to have written consent from the client in order to share anything about that assessment result or anything about that client to an outside party. So an example of this would be the behavior analyst completed assessment on a 7th grader engaging in SIB. Let's say the child's family friend like comes over to them like after school one day and asks like, oh, I'm a good family friend of Johnny. He's really close with my son, and I just want to know like what I can do to help. What did your assessment show? Is there anything we can do when he's over at our house? Yada yada yada. And the behavior analyst doesn't have that written consent from the boy or his parents saying that they can share it with this individual. So they could not share any of that assessment information with that individual because the client did not give consent for that. So, as I mentioned earlier, if you do not follow this code, there are huge implications. The first being that the client has right to a functional and appropriate treatment program, and without the code, all treatment would be developed based off guesswork. Sorry for the typo there. I just noticed that the D in based off is on the off and not on the based. Sorry about that. The next point would be that the client has a right to confidentiality, and so without the code, the behavior analyst could share client information to outside sources without that client's permission, and that leads to mistrust and it leads to ineffectiveness of treatment. And also, it's impossible to identify a true function of behavior without that baseline. And this code basically says that you can start behavioral intervention from biased and untrained observations, which is completely unethical. So that here's my works cited with our Bailey and Birch text. That is it for explaining code 3.4 and 3.5. I look forward to all of your input in the discussion board, and please let me know if you have any questions.